And I would say, on some days, and I'll say it tonight, but I won't argue it tonight, is that to be Catholic with a capital C, we have to be Catholic with a small c. We have to be able to reach out beyond our own tradition. And let me give you just one quote to support this, a radical quote about what dialogue is. By dialogue, we let God be present in our midst. As we open ourselves in dialogue to one another, we open ourselves to God. Which is actually fairly incredible. Now, what is interreligious dialogue about? It's being open to God. It's about God being present in our Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, native traditions midst. And if we open ourselves interreligiously, there is God.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here for this important lecture. When I invited Frank Clooney and I told him that this would be the venue, he said, "This is way too big. Can't we move to a smaller venue and look at how many people are here?" So we're really delighted to see you all here. My name is Catherine Corneel. I'm a professor of comparative theology in the Department of Theology, and I'm very happy and honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Frank Clooney. So this is the second of this semester's Lowell lecture and the 8th of the academic year. It also coincides with the Candlemas lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Department of Theology. So Professor Frank Clooney is a Jesuit from New York. He joined the Society of Jesus in 1968 and was ordained a priest in 1978. He received his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago, and he taught here at Boston College from 1984 until 2005. He is now the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. And he was also the Director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School from 2010 until 2017. His own area of teaching and research focuses on Hinduism and Hindu-Christian comparative theology and dialogue. And I'm sure we will hear a lot of details about his own life story and background of his engagement with Hinduism and religions in general during his lecture. But let me just tell you that Professor Clooney is known throughout the world as the founder of the modern discipline of comparative theology. In his publications and his own life, he has exemplified a way of engaging other religious traditions respectfully and with integrity of the other religion, and the need to study it on its own terms, but also open to what one may learn from other religious traditions. In a world and scholarly environment where there has been a growing division between the disciplines of theology and religious studies, Professor Clooney has demonstrated the possibility and the importance of bridging the two disciplines and engaging in deep theological conversation across religious traditions. His many publications cover the range from translations of Hindu texts, comparisons of Hindu and Christian sacred texts, history of Jesuit missions in India, and more theoretical reflections on the field of comparative theology and the future of Hindu-Christian studies. He has published or edited over 20 books that I cannot enumerate, but I'll just mention a few of my own favorites that are very often quoted: Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary. Then his book on Beyond Compare, St. Francis de Sales and Sri Vedanta Deshika on Loving Surrender to God. My very favorite one is his Hiding Places, Darkness, a Hindu Catholic Theopoetics of Divine Absence. And his recent publications are also numerous and varied. His books include Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters in 2019, Western Jesuit Scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals in 2020. He is currently writing an intellectual autobiography tentatively titled Priest and Scholar, Catholic and Hindu, A Love Story. Frank Clooney is currently president of the Catholic Theological Association of Society of America, which is the oldest and the largest society bringing together Catholic theologians in the United States. In 2019, he received from that very society the John Courtney Murray Award, which is the highest recognition bestowed by fellow theologians. In the Boston area, here at Boston College, he has developed the area of comparative theology prior to going to Harvard. And at Harvard itself, he also developed the field of comparative theology. In the Boston Theological Institute, he also established the Society for Comparative Theology. He was instrumental in establishing the Comparative Theology group at the American Academy of Religion, as well as the Catholic Theological Society of America. He has trained in his long career and mentored a whole generation of younger comparative theologians, and thus has had an outsized influence, I think, on the development of the field. In addition to this high-powered academic career, he has also continued to serve as associate pastor at Our Ladies of Sorrows, pastor in Sharon, Massachusetts, where most parishioners have only a vague notion of his importance and fame on the national and international scale. The title of his lecture tonight is On the Edge: Reflections on Being a Catholic Intellectual Amid Many Religions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Clooney.
Thank you, Catherine, for that very fine and generous introduction. And it is so good to be back here at Boston College on this occasion. Thank you all for coming. I know this is a very prestigious lecture series. I remember when Father Bill Leonard, who was here for many years, would talk about it. He founded it, I think, like in the 1940s. And it's continued since. Father Francis Sweeney ran the program for many years when I was here, a delightful man. And I'm so glad to see that it continues over the years, and I'm honored to be part of this tradition. To plunge right in, it's almost 50 years ago, I think it was October of 1973, that I was already in Kathmandu. I went out on a tour with a few friends outside the Kathmandu Valley to the south to a place called Dakshin Kali. And Dakshin Kali was an old, small, kind of rustic Hindu temple dedicated to the goddess Kali. And I remember I had no background, no preparation, but I show up there on the Tuesday morning. It was misty, it was cold, it's up in the Himalayas. And I was unprepared, I think, for what I found there, because Tuesday and Saturday are the days of animal sacrifice at the Kali temple. And so there I was, barefoot in the outer precinct of the temple, looking in where the priest was killing one goat after another, giving them back to the people for food and keeping a part for himself. There was blood all over the place. I could have, in those days at least, I could have walked in, mucking around in the blood a little bit, I suppose. I could have gone into the precinct. And people at those days didn't really notice me. I mean, it didn't seem to matter who I was or why I was there. And I somehow was finding myself confronting what I had left New York for, what I had left America for, going to the other side of the world to teach in the Jesuit high school, being there in Kathmandu, finding something truly different. What I noticed and what I found, and really what's a theme for my presentation tonight, is that I could have reacted to different. I could have been repulsed. What is this animal sacrifice? What is this blood being offered? What awful things are going on here? I could have exoticized it and said, this is, the East, this is what they do in the East. This is so unusual, we would never do things like this in our religion. And on, I could have had different reactions. But the thing that surprised me most was that I somehow I had found exactly what I was looking for, which I didn't know. I knew almost nothing about Hinduism when I got to Kathmandu in the summer of '73. I hadn't read, I hadn't taken college courses, but I had an instinct that that's where I wanted to be, and I ended up in Kathmandu, up in the mountains. And somehow this encounter with the other, a true other who I could not really reconcile and put in place, somehow resonated with me at a deep level. I love going to temples. Later on, I was in Calcutta, went to the Kali Ghat, the great Kali temple across from where Mother Teresa had her first home for the dying. Dakshineshwar, where the great Hindu saint Ramakrishna worshipped the goddess Kali, and dozens of other temples that I've visited over the years, including out in Ashland, the Lakshmi temple not that far from here. And I puzzle myself and puzzle over the fact that I find these things so attractive and so interesting right from the start. 73, it was surely in the period after Vatican II, and it was a time of liberality and openness in the church in which somebody like me, as a young Jesuit seminarian preparing for ordination, could affirm and find this understandable, attractive, compelling in some way without getting into trouble, without being censured for crossing over into idolatry. But I think in an odd way it also had to do with my growing up Catholic. So I'm Irish Catholic, born in Brooklyn, New York, grew up on Staten Island in New York City, and all the kind of pre-Vatican II paraphernalia was still in place. The sacramentals, the confession boxes, the statues around the church. I was an altar boy. I'm old enough that I learned the altar boy prayers in Latin, and young enough that after a year the pastor told us, okay, now it's going to be in English. I loved serving Mass, both when the priest had his back to the people and when the priest was facing the people as we have now. I loved benediction. It seemed to me to be sacred and holy with the incense, the flowers, the lights, and so on. And I think that somehow this experience, growing up in a sacramental system, somehow gave me the resources in myself to be able to say, yes, this is where I want to be when I came to India and visited the Kali temple. It was not a theological position. I wasn't at that point ready to write a book like Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses, and the Virgin Mary. I wasn't ready to start theologizing who Kali was. I'm not sure I'm ready yet to say who Kali is. But nonetheless, there was an instinct in me that this is where I wanted to be, and that gave me a disposition moving forward. As I've thought about these things over the year, and these holy places, sacramentals, shrines, sites of the saints that we have so all over the place in our Catholic context, I thought, as many people do, back to the book of Exodus, chapter 3. When the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called out to him from the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." And then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And that passage has, through the years, I think, stood out for me as kind of a guide, again, pre-theological, but a guide about what we're doing when we learn interreligiously. We need to be humble. We need to go to the places, disarming ourselves, taking our shoes off, feeling the earth below our feet, going into the holy places and saying, I am in the presence of something I don't understand, just as Moses did not understand what he was getting into. And that fact of not understanding but being in a holy place, I think, has characterized a lot of my work over the years. And therefore, at a very profound and basic level, I'd say a very Catholic level, before it comes to theology, that the encounter of religions can very well be kind of a sacramental meeting point, embodied, full of material images, sounds, colors, tastes, and smells. We begin to meet each other before we can catch up and begin to understand what it is we're talking about, where we have gone in this holy place or another. So I began with temples, I began with these images, I began with Kali and the blood spilling off the altar. As I spent my 2 years in Kathmandu as teaching in a school, I also began to pick up on words. The boys who were teenage boys, in many ways, were ordinary teenagers, but both the boys and in the neighborhood, you could hear bhajans, or devotional songs being sung. You could hear people singing in honor of Ramakrishna, or singing Raghupati Rama, the famous hymn that Gandhi loved. And I began to pick up on these things. I'm not very musical, but I began to pick up on the fervor and the devotion that comes with these sounds, and how important it was for me to hear these things. Or when I first, into a 10th grade classroom, brought parts of the Bhagavad Gita, particularly that chapter 11, if any of you know the Gita, where Arjuna, having heard Krishna give his teaching, says, "Show me yourself as you are." And he's totally overwhelmed by a powerful image of Krishna who's absolutely overwhelming, terrifying. Everything is contained in Krishna. I am time, I am death. And that was overwhelming. And to share it with high school kids who are Hindu and Buddhist was for me very powerful. But I remember in that same fall of 1973, the first text that really turned me on, I was proctoring a study hall, and I ran to the library and picked up a book so I'd sit at the desk looking like I was doing something. And the book I picked up was Gitanjali, Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, which I learned only later had won the Nobel Prize, the first non-European to win the prize. And I read the first song. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again and fillest it ever with new life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales. Thou hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages passed and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. I was hooked. I've been hooked by visiting holy places. I was hooked by the boys I visited. I was hooked by the songs I heard. And suddenly I was hooked by what I was reading. And I think my crossing over, sort of being Catholic, remaining Catholic, still Catholic, crossing over and finding kind of an open door between the Hindu and the Catholic was beginning in those sacred days. Now, those 2 years I was in Kathmandu were not just a visit, but it was part of Jesuit formation. So in those days, we had abbreviated the formation process, and it was only a 10-year process, which sounds like a long time, but now that I'm older, it doesn't seem like that long a time. And being there in Kathmandu was preceded by learning and followed by learning. So I'd gone to a Jesuit high school in Manhattan, Regis High School, learned tons of Latin and Greek, read English literature, learned to love reading, learned to love the classics, learned to love translating. And when I entered the society, the same pattern continued. At Fordham University, we had an excellent philosophy faculty, excellent course in philosophy. But the thing I really loved doing was not the theories or the concepts or the philosophical ideas, but picking up, for the most part in translation, a text of Plato or a text of Aristotle or Plotinus or the medievals up to modern figures and reading the text and puzzling over it and fighting with it. That's what I began to love. The favorite course I had at Fordham in philosophy was Father William Richardson, who came up here and was here a professor for many years, reading Heidegger, and we were sort of reading Heidegger, being in time together in the classroom. And somehow this was for me formative. Again, not the ideas, not the concepts, not the arguments, but plunging into the text and reading it in the original if you can, but at least reading it and finding your way in the text. Reading Shakespeare as well. I was a classics major with philosophy, but in my heart of hearts, I should have been an English major, I think, because I loved reading Shakespeare, I loved the plays, I loved the things I was learning, reading the dramas. When I got to theology, after I came back from Kathmandu, I had my first visit here to Cambridge, across the river. In 1975, did my master's degree in theology, my MDiv, in order to be ordained. And again, a wonderful formation with the ideas in the classroom and the piety of the community life, learning the practices of being a priest, learning to be a preacher, learning to be a person who could stand at the altar with some credibility. We're all being woven together where the intellectual and spiritual were not separate. And that for me was extremely important. I remember again, particularly the scripture courses for which I'm grateful. Father Richard Clifford, who still is here at BC these many years later, teaching the Psalms, teaching the prophets, showing us how to read even when we didn't know Hebrew. Father Dan Harrington, Father Joseph Fitzmyer, Father George McCrae, who was over at Harvard, reading the Gospels, reading the New Testament text, and saying, plunge into it. Don't just generalize about it. Don't just theorize about it. Plunge into the text and read it. And I think that was, for me, so exciting. In my last year, very complicated year, after I was ordained, I spent one more year in Cambridge before going to grad school in Chicago. And that year, I started studying Sanskrit. I was working in a parish, and I spent the year reading Augustine in Latin with Father Brian Daly, who had just joined the Weston faculty over in Cambridge at that time. And it was this kind of marvelous double dipping into reading and preaching, all these things were coming together. And I think I'm ever grateful for the fact that this formation process was so powerful. I mean, it was learned, it was informative, it was stimulating, It was waking up my mind and my soul both. It filled me with unending questions and a realization that none of the text I was reading could I ever be done with. I was drawn into the philosophy text, the literary text, the theological text, the biblical text, and realized that I'd never get out again. That these are the things that I really cared about and wanted to belong with, and that I was in over my head again and again. Then and later on, a go-to text for me was Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And for me, again, in the Vatican II Church, but also a permission to learn without restraint, to not be afraid of learning and where the learning would lead you. And so I was ordained in 78, and having this commitment to reading and learning deeply, my provincial, God forbid, wanted me to go to Germany and study theology. And I could have, that could have been wonderful. There's so many great theologians in Germany that I could have learned from. And it would have been a wonderful career. But I said, no, it's India, it's Hinduism I want to go deeper into. And if I don't learn the languages, I'll never be able to do it right. And so I persuaded the provincial, God bless him, he didn't put up a fight. He surrendered to me and let me do what I wanted. Good Jesuit obedience. Let me do what I wanted. And I ended up going to the University of Chicago, the South Asia department, where I spent 3 years of coursework basically reading Sanskrit texts, the classical language, and Tamil texts in that great language of South India. And the professors in that department were not theological, they were not anti-theological, but they were lovers of literature. And they said, come here, we will teach you to read and read and read and read, and then do what you want. It's up to you what you do with this. And so for me, it was like a perfect mirror to the learning that I had begun to do in the Jesuit tradition. And for them, who were men of great erudition and men of great, they were all men, sorry, men of great erudition, great learning, this sense of being a person who could read literature, who cared about it, who had taste for it. One of my professors, Edwin Giroux, a great professor, he could write verses in Sanskrit and recite them when guests came through. A.K. Ramanujan, the great Tamil scholar in the department, MacArthur Genius Award, wrote poetry in English, wrote poetry in Indian languages, and did the most beautiful translations. And I began to find that I was having a new formation, a second formation. After my Jesuit formation, those 10 years, 11 years, in the South Asia department at Chicago, this other formation was taking place. I was reading in Hindu ritual theory, which couldn't fit into the Western ways of thinking. It forced me to think outside the box. I was reading Vedanta. You are the ultimate reality. You are the true self. And it didn't fit into my Christian framework. But rather than worrying about the details, like does this all work out, loving to plunge into it and to see what people meant. And that was exciting. And as a grad student, I went back to India, this time not to the north, but to South India, to Tamil Nadu, Madras, and spent 1.5 years working on my dissertation and so on. And I realized there that the great gift was that I was studying with some pundits. And these were learned men, they're all learned men who were experts in the Sanskrit literature, which I was working on in those days, utterly dedicated to it. And once they realized that I was not to be suspected, that I was serious about this, that I really wanted to learn from them, they said, good, we're going to read the text. I had a certain text that I wanted to read for my dissertation, was like up here somewhere. And he said, well, you, the main teacher I had, you can get to that text, but for the first 12 years, you need to do this and this and this and this. And in the nicest possible way, in his mix of Sanskrit and Tamil, saying to me, you are not ready for that at all. Slow down. And I only stayed 1.5 years. I didn't stay for 12 years. But it was a sense of another formation, a second formation. And part of my being on the edge, which is the title of my talk, is that somehow I was being formed twice over. In the Catholic, in the Jesuit tradition, in the learning of the great tradition of the West, and then plunging into and meeting these learned teachers of India and beginning to imagine and feel and kind of get the embodied reality of their learning as well. And it was quite lovely because I was out of control. I didn't know how to fit together what I was learning in India with what I had learned in philosophy study or theology study in this country. But again, that instinct I have, that I think was the same instinct I had when I went into the Kali temple, is that's okay. You're not here to be in control, you're here to let go and to see what happens. And I think that has been a plan for me over the years. When I went back, I was already teaching at BC, but I went back to India in 1992 for another year. I fell in love with Tamil devotional literature, which was like a different side of the brain, a different affective kind of reach and relationship that I fell in. And I'll just read you two verses from that, because it was a whole different level of emotional attachment, because interreligious study, comparative theology, could be very conceptual, very brainy. But this poetry kind of pushed me in a new direction. Today and tomorrow, a little longer still, your grace is all I've got. Surely, without you, O Lord, I am not. But see, Lord, without me, you are not. Whichever form pleases his people, that is God's form. Whichever name pleases his people, that is God's name. Whatever color pleases his people, those who contemplate him unwearying, that is his color. He protects us. And this poetry was like diving into another ocean. And I've been reading it this afternoon, trying to figure out what to do before this lecture. I was translating some Tamil poetry, believing that the deeper you go, the better off you are. What I'd like to say to finish this first part of my lecture is that on one level, this was all marvelous. The learning, the thinking, the crossing over, the crossing back, mixing together Jesuit formation with formation, a little bit of formation in Hindu tradition as well. But on another level, it was actually fairly improbable. I mean, I was learning to live with these antinomies between the Hindu and the Christian, between one God and many gods, between God and goddess, between God having one name, the name of Jesus, and all the different names that gods and goddesses have in the Indian context. One birth, many births, the church, other religious communities, my Catholic training, my Catholic head, my Catholic heart, touching at least on a Hindu head and Hindu heart. And what I realized over time was that there was really nothing in my background that made this really possible. Again, I have the greatest respect for Brooklyn and the greatest respect for being Irish Catholic in New York. But there was nothing in that background that sort of prepared me for taking this plunge. And anyone who knew me in 68 or 70, when I was the youngest Jesuit for a while, nobody thought that I would do this. This was nothing on my agenda, no plan, no schedule. How did this come about? People ask me all the time, why did you study Hinduism? What were you looking for? And what I'd like to do now is, if you're patient, is sort of take a mystical interlude and refer back to an experience that I think enabled me to do this, talk about this experience briefly that happened before I was a Jesuit, and then talk about coming to BC, moving to Harvard, and so on as the third part of my talk. But in 1966, I was in high school. I was at that point, July of 66, I was 15 years old. And I was minding my own business, you know, whatever kids do in the summer, mucking around on Staten Island, doing this and that, because school was over. And one night, I had this incredibly powerful experience. And I've been writing about it, so I'll just read you what I wrote on this point. It was a hot night, humid, even stifling. It was quiet. I was alone in my childhood bedroom. The house was very quiet. I could not get to sleep. I was restless. Eventually, I knew I would fall asleep, and I was not expecting anything unusual to happen. But then I felt a very strong presence, a physical nearness that I saw to be God coming to me. It was God entering me, piercing me deep within. It was the touch of the divine. And that touch for me was an awakening, akin to a sexual awakening, I think. No words, no vision, just being apprehended, taken over from the inside, so much, and just for an instant. That blissful moment brought tears to my eyes, for I took it to mean that from now on my life was in the hands of God, who had touched me, and that from now on I could be only for God. I forgot now the words that I used at that moment. I do not remember them, but they were silent words of total unconditional surrender. Moment finishes, it's still a hot night. I do fall asleep, I get up the next day, and life is back to normal. And yet for that moment, there was like a crossover. It wasn't intellectual, it wasn't something I was looking for, it wasn't something I was asking for, but there was this like contact. I would say contact with God. And what difference did it make? I mean, I have a list of things here that, this ignition, this kind of the spark that took my Catholic life and brought it to life. The touch of God, all of everything happening in a single moment, connected, quiet ecstasy, utter vulnerability, the reciprocity of wisdom and love flowing back and forth, forgiving and being forgiven, being utterly free, and yet without new choices before me. As it were, a glimpse of the divine perspective on the entire human set of possibilities, encountering God who is meeting me at the edge between my world and God's world. And I think this experience kind of opened for me a whole way of thinking about life that at age 15, 2 years later, I entered the society, I went to Fordham to study philosophy then and so on like that. I didn't really understand all of this, but it was beginning to open my eyes, possibilities beyond I could imagine. I was reading, the voice that I gave it at that point was the Brothers Karamazov. I was reading the Brothers Karamazov this summer. If you know the story, the elder Zosima has a profound effect on the young man Alyosha, the youngest of the brothers. And after Zosima has died and Alyosha has seen him in the tomb and hears the reading of the Gospel Cana of Galilee, where Jesus multiplies and makes the abundance of wine, Alyosha rushes outside. And it says, and this is in the old Constant Gardner translation, in his rapture he was weeping even over the stars, which were shining to him from the abyss of space. And he was not ashamed of that ecstasy. There seemed to be threads from all those innumerable worlds of God linking his soul to them, and it was trembling all over in contact with other worlds. He longed to forgive everyone and everything, to beg forgiveness, not for himself, but for all people, for all and for everything. And then the final part. And for that, with that very instant, again, just an instant, he felt clearly and as it was tangibly that something firm and unshakable as that vault of heaven had entered his soul. It was as though some idea had seized the sovereignty of his mind, and it was all for his life and forever and ever. Reading that, again, 15 years old, did I understand Russian literature? Not really. Did I understand translation issues, problems across cultural boundaries? Not really. But reading this and having that experience, somehow everything is connected to everything. Everything is open, everything is forgiven, everything is all one reality. And I think this set the scene for going to Kathmandu, going to that temple and saying, yes, this too is connected. These things are not apart from one another. Years later, I would theorize this in different ways. When I read Bernard Lonergan's Insight, which, by the way, my first experience of BC was coming over here in '76 to take a course with Father Lonergan. So that was my BC start. But when I read Insight as an undergraduate at Fordham, it opens with the scene where Archimedes, the Greek thinker, jumps out of his bathtub and says Eureka and runs naked through the streets because he's now understood gravity and how to measure things and so on. Or I was thinking also of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote the famous book on scientific revolutions. Not that book, but what he accounts in other texts that another text about, he's staring out the window one day, he's bored to death reading Aristotle. He doesn't understand how Aristotle could have made so many mistakes in his philosophy and physics. And then suddenly it clicks. And suddenly he says, now I realize and understood that while I could never be an Aristotelian scientist, I suddenly realized that it all made sense if you could only leave where you are and go there. And he said, yes, that is my experience too. Leave where you are and go there, and it will begin to make sense. Or here, and it's somewhat on the edge of arrogance, to say Ignatius Loyola, as a young Jesuit, I read, like all novices and all young Jesuits did, his autobiography. And he talks about the experience at the Cardona River, where he has this experience that changes everything. And he's speaking in the third person. He understood and knew many things, both spiritual things and matters of faith and learning. And this was with so great an enlightenment that everything seemed new to him. It was as if he was a new man with a new intellect. He could not even now explain in detail what he then understood. There were many things, but he can say that he received such lucidity of understanding that during the course of his entire life, if he were to gather all the help he received from God and everything he knew and add all together, He does not think it would add up to what he had received in that instant. And I said, oh, that's what it's about. That's why I'm a Jesuit. I have that in common with Ignatius, and again, I don't want to push that too far because experts can say, no, you don't understand that passage. But nonetheless, I thought of that experience. I end this kind of mystical interlude, and the reason for pointing this out is that when people ask me about comparative theology, why? What are you trying to do? Where does this come from? And it comes from being a Jesuit, it comes from going to Kathmandu, it comes from going to Kali Temple, it comes from reading Sanskrit philosophy and Tamil poetry. But it also comes from this deeper, simple intuition of God connected to us, God touching us, and everything is touching everything else. Why would you be afraid to cross over? 1984, the third part. I come to Boston College. I must hear, I think he's not here, but nonetheless, shout out and thanks to Father Robert Daly, who was here for many, many years, chair of the department. Before I went to India in '82, he called me in Chicago. I had written a letter saying I'm interested when I come back from India looking for a job. He said, come now before you go. Summer of '82, did a job interview, met the dean, met the VP. I don't think I met the president, but met all kinds of people. Bang, you have a job when you come back from India. And Father Daly made all this possible. And it was, as it is now, a wonderful department. Wonderful people, wonderful connections, wonderful thought moving forward. Professor Fane Perkins is still here, who was there when I came in '84. Lisa Cahill is here, who was here when I came in '84. I'm sorry, there may be others, but it was a wonderful occasion to be in the theology department at BC. And yet I'm aware that at that point, I was sort of, despite being a Jesuit, which is hardly an outsider on a Jesuit campus, I was something of an outsider because I was doing something and being something that really didn't fit. I remember some of the older members of the faculty who were not entirely unfriendly, but bordering on unfriendly, by saying, we hired you to teach world religions. We didn't hire you to work with our doctoral students. And by the way, there's nothing really worth knowing about Hinduism. It's very thin. It's all lacking. So just teach the undergrads, entertain them, and we'll take care of the doctoral program. And this really annoyed me. And I said, I'm not a comparative religion person. I am here to introduce India and make things known about India. But basically, I'm a Catholic theologian who's crossed over and wants to show that we can be Catholic in an interreligious world. And so, with many colleagues and friends who were very supportive, I was able to push back and make my way. But to understand comparative theology, just a list of things that I thought I was not because of the experiences I've been having, which I hope I've communicated to you. I was not somebody who was just teaching world religions, because I wanted you to learn a tradition, become part of it, become engaged in it, make it part of your life. I was not engaged in religious studies, although I have great respect for the American Academy of Religion, many of my colleagues at Harvard who are religious studies persons, but I didn't want this like scholarly hands-off approach. I was saying, no, you're a theologian, this is spiritual formation, enter into it and be part of it. I was not interested immediately in systematic or doctrinal theology. Even now I say that we should get to doctrinal claims and so on, but maybe it'll take 100 years or 500 years because we don't know enough about each other. So let's have that down the road, let's put that off and we'll come back to that later. And I didn't even want a theology of religions, Christ and the world religions. Is there salvation outside the church? Although I respected colleagues who worked on these things in great professional way, because it seemed to me I wasn't learning, go to the Kali temple, read Tamil poetry, is Christ present here? But somehow me as a Catholic receiving this and beginning to make sense of it, that's what I wanted to communicate to my students. And that the doctrinal questions and thinking about the religions could come later, but if you're thinking about the religions before you actually know anything that's in the religions or of the religions, you're wasting your time. So that was my point and my idea. So comparative theology, in genealogy, my invention of it, although I learned early on in my career at BC, there was a 300-year history of comparative theology and the use of the word back to the very end of the 17th century, when a book was written, Theologia Comparativa. So I didn't invent it. I thought I did, but I didn't invent it. It went way back and has all kinds of ideas and connections to it. But faith seeking understanding across religious borders, crossing over to the other, dwelling there, and then coming back. Respecting and learning from local and native languages and traditions and practices without merely colonizing them and making them like yourself. Resisting meta explanations that flatten everything and make it all sound the same. Always getting personal, always making it a matter of experience, always saying, we can cross over, this can make sense. So the project I had when I got to BC, implicitly, because the first years of teaching, you don't really know what you're doing, you're just trying to survive, was to make sense of my experience, my double education, my double formation as a Jesuit, philosophy, theology, Indian studies, Catholic tradition, pundits in India, holding all this together by being clear what I didn't want to do, and then figuring out how to work it. And I think, and I'll go briefly because our time is running fast, that it was the same kind of practice, the same kind of set of intuitions at work in my teaching, in my preaching in the parish, and in everything I've written over these 40 plus years. That has to do with communicating information. It certainly has to do with making known something about the Indian traditions and Hinduism in particular that many people still do not know much about. And for freshmen in the core course, or doctoral students or colleagues at the Catholic Theological Society, American Academy of Religion, the obligation to try to present all of this in a way that is communicable, intelligible, that makes sense so that people are not afraid to learn interreligiously. That was important. To be able to show that it's not incompatible with Catholic theology. And here I did and would dip, and still do dip, into various kinds of Christology, doctrine of God, ecclesiology, sacramental theology, liturgical theology, and so on, in order to show that you don't have to give up on the basics of the faith. You don't have to move away from the creed in order to learn interreligiously, but you can learn from where you are, and there are wonderful resources in Catholic tradition, and that's what I tried to do in graduate classes, but also with freshmen in the college. And to be able then to create, and this is why I always use primary text in my courses even now, is to create the situation in the class where students can begin not simply to hear this is what the professor thinks, or here's what I could learn on Wikipedia about Hinduism or Buddhism, or here is a theory about ancient India, medieval India, modern India, but rather to say, here you are confronting a text like the Bhagavad Gita and Arjuna's experience of Krishna. You're reading an Upanishad in which you're told you are the absolute reality. You're reading a text about a goddess that draws you in and says, "Oh goddess, you are the mother of all things." Not that you believe everything you read, because you can't do that, but somehow that you can be exposed to it and begin to imagine across the boundaries. That was what I was trying to do. And so when I got to BC, my first year, and God bless Bob Daly again for allowing me to do these things, I taught a course called Gods and Goddesses of India, and then another course called Holy Men and Women of India. Primary text in both courses, saints, divine figures, goddesses, gods, and so on. And I think it went well. I think it was a good choice. I do remember one day on the staircase in Carney Hall, where we used to have the department, I was going up and there was an older Jesuit, not in the theology department, coming down. He was very friendly, very gracious, and he was until the day of his death. But he had, "How are things going? It's your first year here." And I said, "Things are going well. My courses, Gods and Goddesses of India, and Holy Men and Women of India are going well. Students like the courses." And he kind of looked at me quizzically and said, "You realize, and I hope you communicate to them, that these gods and goddesses are not real. They're myth. Do you make clear to them that these are not true? That none of this ever happened?" And I said, "Well, or how about the Holy Men and Women of India, the saints of India? Do you realize that you can't be a saint unless you're a Christian? And so saints, you can have Hindu saints or Buddhist saints. It's a matter of our Catholic tradition." And then he continued down the stairs and I continued up the stairs. But it was a matter of kind of opening things up. And then we had the wonderful, for 25 years, the religious quest, the comparative portion of the core that went back and forth. And I realized that there, as later on at Harvard, the whole thing was about opening possibilities so that young people today would begin to learn the possibility of crossing over and beginning to learn interreligiously. And that my job is not to preach in the classroom and not to persuade people to convert or not to convert, but rather to be able to say, let's read this Hindu creation account along with Genesis. Let's read this passage about Krishna as teacher along with this passage as Jesus as teacher. And if you have your brains and if you're paying attention, you'll see they're not the same. But nonetheless, you needn't be afraid to learn from the other and to cross over. When I've come to Harvard, I do the same thing all these years later. I'm almost as long at Harvard now as I was at BC. That's why I'm going to hang on and get to 21 years at Harvard. But I'm teaching every other year now a course called Who Needs God? And we begin with sociological data and so on like that, and then plunge into scriptural texts, biblical texts, Vedic texts. We read part of the Bhagavad Gita along with the Gospel, and we read on and on. And again, the point for Harvard students and divinity school students and college students is that often they've been brought up either with no religion, the div school ones have sought it out obviously, or a very kind of low church sense of religion where theology is really not that important, where revelation doesn't really work. And trying to open up and say, but if you read this text and if you realize what it's asking of you, what is your position in relationship to it? Where does it lead you? What do you want to do with this? And in this course of mine, where we read Genesis and the Upanishads, St. Bonaventure's Journey of the Mind to God, along with a medieval goddess text, my favorite is reading Thérèse of Lisieux, Story of a Soul, which is not a popular text in Harvard Divinity School. It's a 19th century saint, in some ways sweet and sentimental, in some ways weird, on borderline not so healthy kind of person, along with Ramakrishna, the great master, the story of Ramakrishna, parts of it, where he was definitely borderline, tried to kill himself at one point to have union with the goddess, would go into ecstasies. Reading these two people together is almost impossible, because in some ways, even though they lived at the same time, have nothing in common, no mutual influence. But to be able to say, if you take one of them up, you may have a hard time. If you take two of them up, it actually gets easier. And to begin to understand ecstatic religion, love that's over the top, possibilities that are impossible but not really so. And I think it's a great achievement that I can teach at Harvard Divinity School and be able to bring out and make sense of the fact we can teach Thérèse of Lisieux at Harvard Divinity School if we teach her with Ramakrishna, a Hindu saint. And that kind of thing back and forth. And to go briefly, I could have a section, but I'll skip it for now, about preaching. The same thing in the parish. You don't teach from the pulpit in a academic sense, but you do want to open up the readings so that people are confronted by them, not simply what does Father say or what's the moral application, but that you become part of the reading. Like the gospel for tomorrow morning, Jesus meets the Canaanite woman, and the tug back and forth, and he's kind of transformed as she is. How do you preach on a text like that you realize there's some kind of an interreligious possibility there? And how do you make that open? And the same, again, I won't go into it. Catherine's already mentioned some of my books, Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Beyond Compare, Loving Surrender to God. But in the writing, I try to be respectable and publish with respectable presses and so on like that. And I think I've managed to do that. I'm grateful to publishers. But always at some level of my writing, and you see this very clearly in the book, His Hiding Place is Darkness, where I'm reading the Song of Songs and medieval commentaries, Bernard of Clairvaux and so on, with medieval Tamil poetry with commentators, is that it's all about knowing God so deeply and loving God so deeply that the absence of God is palpable. Not that it's no God or the unknown God, but the God who is with you withdraws and then your life is transformed. And what I'm hoping is, that book was published by Stanford University Press. I'm hoping that when people would read a book like that, it might evoke and provoke religious thoughts and sentiments about what do you do when you lose that which you love, and when you realize that people have been talking about this for a very long time. Last part, I'm almost done. I'm watching the clock. I think I'm raising issues, I think you can see, using my life story as an example about interreligious learning, the possibilities of being a person of faith in an interreligious world, learning, thinking, being at a university, but also at some deeper level realizing it's a vocational matter. And for me, again, back to 1966 when I had my God experience and everything that followed from that, that somehow we can be people of faith, people with experience of God and encounter with God, and then still learn interreligiously. And I would say, in some days, and I'll say it tonight, but I won't argue it tonight, is that to be Catholic with a capital C, we have to be Catholic with a small c. We have to be able to reach out beyond our own tradition. And let me give you just one quote to support this, a radical quote about what dialogue is. By dialogue, we let God be present in our midst. As we open ourselves in dialogue to one another, we open ourselves to God. Which is actually fairly incredible. That what is interreligious dialogue about? It's being open to God. It's about God being present in our Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Muslim, native traditions midst. And if we open ourselves interreligiously, there is God. St. John Paul the Great said this in India in 1986, and it's been a mantra for me for many years. At that point, I can say, the field is doing very well, comparative theology. There's my book, Comparative Theology, 2010. People like Mark Heim, who used to teach at Andover Newton, now at Yale. His book on crucified wisdom, Buddhist Christian wisdom. Catherine's wonderful book, Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology. Pim Valkenburg, Catholic University, has a new Brill companion to comparative theology. John Tutamanel and Loy Ashton have a series of comparative theology books at Fordham University Press. There is comparative theology enterprises elsewhere in the world, maybe most notably Professor Klaus von Stosch in Germany, particularly Muslim Catholic theology. There's a comparative theology reading group in Australia that goes forward. All of these things seem to be burgeoning and opening, and there seem to be so many possibilities that are certainly far beyond me and my generation. But I would say that because the stakes are so high and the possibilities are so great, we again have to slow down and go small. And I won't go into it because of time, but I would say that given these great possibilities, I could write big and loud books about the future of theology and so on. But what I'm doing now, and again I was doing this afternoon, is puttering, reading some medieval Tamil poetry, preparing it for a translation. Because I believe that you have to get back to the nitty-gritty again and again. The first verse of the 500 verses I'm translating, my lamp for worship, earth the lamp's bowl, ocean the melted butter, fiery sun the flame. With this lamp, by this garland of words, I adorn the feet of the Lord with the red flaming discus, and I cry out, let us drain dry the ocean of sorrows, samsara. And the last verse in the whole series, and I'll just read one more. After my many unceasing births, he has come to me. He has transformed me, that cloud-colored Lord. He has uplifted me. He abides within me, within him, that light who dazzles me all the time. And so my very self finally stops moving. It has gained the joy without end. It has become free. And I think the ability to slow down and say, however busy you are, how frantic we are, we have to go back to the micro level in order to find our way forward. And I would say, to conclude, here we are at Boston College. I can't think of a better place for the flourishing of comparative theology than BC. I mean, just think of the resources on campus, the wonderful university in so many ways. I was just listing some of the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies, and Jesuits have been studying other religions for 500 years. The Center for Christian Jewish Learning, which is a magnificent achievement that continues to be wonderful. Newly here, the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History. The current Duffy Lectures in Global Christianity, Father Felix Wilford from India, on kind of cosmopolitanism religiously. All these fabulous things are going on. And then Catherine herself edited a wonderful book recently, Atonement in Comparative Theology, The Cross in Dialogue with Other Religions, which is substantively Catholic on a really Catholic theme, atonement, and truly interreligious at the same time. This happens at BC. And I think there has to be a place where these things are done, not where we talk about it and then not do it. But I think BC is the place where this can happen. A department like the theology department, we have Jewish and Muslim and Buddhist and Catholic and East Asian and African scholars studying the different religions, where this comes across in the teaching in the classroom and faculty conversations and conferences, and where the work of comparative theology is being done day by day. And it's not saying, oh, let's stop being a Catholic theology department and let's become a religious studies department. I hope by now you see I mean the opposite of that. That a place that is truly Catholic, robustly, deeply, energetically Catholic, is precisely the place where comparative theology should be done. BC has the resources, and I don't think there's a better place in the United States than doing it here. And so I'm happy to be part of this tonight and to put before you my personal journey, my personal learning, but also say it's most appropriate to be able to do it here. So thank you all. Happy to.
So, one of the things that stands out for me, you described this as a very Catholic impulse, and I think that's right. That feels right to me, and it feels like a movement of the Spirit that we can do this. And you also, your anecdotes brought it clear that this hasn't always been the way Catholics have understood what Catholic would mean in terms of how we would think about other traditions. I just wonder if you might be able to say something about why do you think this change has happened so tremendously that all of us feel now this must be done, this is a thing we should be doing. We haven't felt that way in older tradition.
Yeah. I mean, as the great missionary scholars like Robert de Nobili and Matteo Ricci in China, de Nobili in India, and others have said, the church has always been mingling interreligiously. In fact, the Jewish people have always been mingling interreligiously. But I think the constraints of a certain kind of concern about inside, outside, a certain kind of priority on certain kind of conceptual learning with deep roots, I think in many cases had made it impossible to talk more openly about the learning. And I think, again, if I had been 10 years older, when I went to Nepal to teach, I might not have been allowed to go to the Kali temple. I might not have been allowed to appreciate the experience and go back. So I think what we have at Vatican II is not a rupture with the past, or we used to be nasty people, now we're nice people or something, but kind of Pope John the 23rd saying, open the windows of the church, let fresh air in. You don't get to control the air that comes in. And I think the created possibilities of the mid-20th century, and all kinds of wild things happened in the 60s and 70s. But as the world became more interconnected, as technology made it possible to travel, to know about the other, in some sense, Vatican II was providential in giving us a green light to go forward learning interreligiously. I would like to think that, if you think of the great movies, the Jesuits in The Mission, the movie, or the Jesuits in Silence more recently, had the capacity, and they noticed all kinds of things going on around them that they weren't really, didn't have the vocabulary or permission to talk about. And in our time, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, various theologians were cautioned by Rome about, you can't go that far, you can't say this, you can't say that. But I think the general trend has been unstoppable and irreversible toward openness interreligiously. As I quoted that passage from John Paul II, when we are in dialogue and learning, we are opening ourselves to God in a new way. Or Pope Francis, so much in his writings and his travels, talking about being interreligiously connected is absolutely essential. Now he means, rightly, work with the poor, work with migrants, work with the homeless in places of violence. But I think it also, all the way across the different disciplines and so on, that things have really changed. But again, without saying, now we have a good church and previously we had a bad church. It's just that the sacramental principle, the ability to find God in all things, actually is opening up in new ways. I hope that helps.
Questions? I want to encourage our VC students to think about questions.
Yeah, I love questions from students, so please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was listening to it almost as if you were giving a meditation, so I think this also speaks of the approach which you have in your theological work, which is very contemplative. At the same time, I wonder, is there any place for evaluation, or how could you define what comparative in the phrase comparative theology that it means, and if you're using this very contemplative, very respectful approach of stepping on the whole ground,
yeah. So how do we get to the more evaluative and critical level about, you mean truth and falsehood, or right and wrong? Is that what you're thinking? Yeah, I mean, certainly, so in terms of comparative theology, any decent comparison is going to notice differences as well as similarities. And if somebody says, oh, these are all the same, they're probably not paying attention too deeply, or they're only getting started. So the differences come to the fore. But then it's a question further, what difference do the differences make? And some of the differences are smaller, they're cultural, they're matters of affective preferences, they're sensibilities of various sorts. And others go deeper. The question that I didn't answer, do Hindu goddesses exist? that the Jesuit on the staircase wanted me to point that out to my students, that they don't exist. Because my thing is, well, where is the first critical learning is, do we know even what they are talking about? And that it can seem really a dodge and say, 50 years from now, 500 years from now, we'll get to that. But if we don't know what we're talking about, then I think we do discredit to the Catholic intellectual tradition. And so for me, a lot of the critical questioning comes not in terms of those larger issues of conflict or difference, which I don't dismiss. I can't dismiss them if I'm a Catholic. But say, well, the problem is you think, not you personally, but somebody thinks this is what the Hindus say, but they don't say that. Well, this is what Buddhists think about nirvana, but they don't actually say what you think they say. Or this is what the Quran says, but they've never read the Quran. And so on, that the corrective process of getting straight what we're learning seems to have to come first. Now, in the volume that Catherine edited on atonement, I think some critical questions do come to the fore. But I find that my job is to, again, open the doorways, to be on the edge, to enhance the learning, and allow people then to be thinking and feeling across the boundaries. And somebody else can be the judge. I don't want to be the judge. But I'm not saying we don't need judges. It's just that I don't want to be that person, even though I could be, I suppose. I'm dodging it, but I hope I did it decently.
I don't know how.
Can you hear me? I say. Thank you, Professor. My question was, I heard this once, and it could be totally unfounded, that in the time in Jesus' life, when that's undocumented, he traveled to India and studied Hinduism. In your time in India, is there anything that told you that it's true, or just is that not true at all?
I've heard this many times, either that Jesus in the so-called hidden years between 12 and 30, spent many of them in India. And this is often said based on the fact, where did he get his spiritual depth? Where did he become this incredibly wise, insightful person with powers to be able to heal and to touch people's lives? He must have gone to a country where these things were prominent. I mean, that would be an insult to the Jewish tradition, in which there are many resources for this. But also, there is unfortunately or fortunately zero evidence that Jesus went anywhere in those 18 years. There's also another tradition that when he didn't die on the cross, he came down off the cross and went off to India. Up in Kashmir, in northwest India, there is a tomb of Jesus. It was not impossible for people to go from Palestine to India in that time period. There were Roman ruins along the coast of India and so on like that. So I think on the historical level, it's impossible to verify. And I think if it's impossible to verify and the sources we do have don't speak of it, I think we'd have to be skeptical. But I think, why are people saying that kind of thing? Again, it's what I just said, that there's an instinct that Jesus somehow is this incredibly deep spiritual figure who easily can be related to by Hindus and Buddhists and others. I know so many Hindus who they don't want to become Christian, they resent conversions, they resent Christian imperialism and colonialism. But they say, but Jesus, yes, he is one who speaks to us in an elemental way. And I think sometimes weaving a historical story, the reason that happens is because he went to India, is maybe an effort to explain it, but at a more primal level, it's just the fact that when Hindus read the gospel, or Buddhists or Muslims, there's so much in common with Islam, that there's a resonance there. And I believe very much in appreciating and opening up the resonance, but not necessarily by arguing that historically something happened that we can't prove, without which it couldn't have happened. But I think there's no evidence for the travels.
We have another student question back at the hall here.
Hello, Professor. I'm enrolled in a Buddhism and Christianity course, and we've engaged in very basic forms of meditation lately. And I've noticed that some of my peers and I struggle to just ground my mind and focus on being at ease with ourselves and with our surroundings. And I guess one other question I would just like to know what your point of view is, or if you have tips to be more grounded and just see thoughts as a flow of ideas and concepts other than.
Yeah. I mean, for many years, Boston College was blessed with the presence of John McCransky on the faculty, who was a splendid meditation teacher in a Buddhist tradition. And he did endless numbers of workshops and seminars and all that, helping people to slow down, watch their breathing, empty the mind. So for many people, finding a teacher, with who to do this, and then no matter how brilliant the teacher is, then you actually have to do it. Like you can go to yoga classes and you learn all these postures, and then after a week you stop doing them. It doesn't work. So that's the first thing, is having a guide or a teacher who knows where things are, where you're going. The second thing would be, back in 1989, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later was Pope Benedict, published an essay, and I realize this is not what you're asking, but an essay in which he cautioned Christians against just plunging into Eastern meditation as if it was the same thing as Christian meditation. And because, as with most things, it's not the same thing. And one can use yogic principles and yogic breathing practices and Buddhist practices for stilling the body, emptying the mind, but without claiming that that's enough in itself for somebody who wants to be a practicing Christian. So I think there are different levels on which one has to be careful but open. I would be of the school to say, be careful, don't assume these things are the same, and then find a Buddhist teacher or a yoga teacher to help you to do this. There's a great book that's out recently, I'd have to look on my laptop to get the title, about distraction in medieval monastic communities in the West, and how one of the great distractions in the monasteries of the 13th, 14th, 15th century was distraction. And you say, what could they possibly be distracted about? They didn't have TV, radio, newspapers, cell phones, other stuff, but it was a constant thing, because the mind is a wild thing, and the mind goes in many directions. I mean, for me, it's a sense, I think it goes back to my childhood, where you are is where God is. And if you can just stop being elsewhere in your mind or wishing you were somewhere else, where you are, like the Saint Ramakrishna says, I can see God as clearly as I can see the palm of my hand. And that's a mystical gift that maybe Ramakrishna had, but in some way to realize it's utterly simple and we make it complicated. And you can do this with a rosary, you can do this by sitting in like the chapel at St. Mary's in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, or with a meditation teacher. But I think a lot of it begins by being healthy, caring for your body, facing up to problems that distract you, like I'm worried about my grades, or I'm worried about my girlfriend, or I'm worried about my boyfriend, or whatever. All these things can really upset people, and realize if I can clear out the things I can, then I open to the spiritual possibilities, the things that I can't. And that's where here and now God is, regardless of what else is going on. That's all I can say at the moment. If you want to talk more afterwards, we could talk about it.
So I take just 2 more questions. We have one here.
Thank you. I was just wondering what you thought the importance of having a disposition that's open to conversion, or that's open to giving up those truth claims, and finding other truths that seem perhaps more convincing within interreligious study or comparative study, personally, and then also as a scholar.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say next question. No, it's a wonderful question, and I think we have to be sincere and say it would be hard to re-explain the Christian tradition and the gospel tradition as if such a thing as conversion didn't exist, or it was somehow a mistake and a misunderstanding, so we can drop that. I think the best ways that it's been talked about in recent times is, again, like I recently taught our novices in California, but a 2007 document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith about the meaning of the interreligious, quoting from Pope Benedict's inaugural homily in 2005, it is natural to share that which we most love and which gives us most joy. And I think what he's trying to say by that is, it's not necessary to say conversion is get soldiers on a ship and go to a foreign country and land and destroy their temples and make them all convert. No. Or stand outside their temple or their mosque and give out pamphlets saying why this is a wicked and evil religion. or simply point out to people you are fundamentally deficient because you're not a member of the church. But on some other level, if we are people who ourselves have been converted, and if somehow we, if we're Christian, are in love with Jesus Christ and have that as part of our life, showing that. I mean, you know the old thing, I think Francis of Assisi said, preach at all times, use words only when necessary. So that's the general thing. The second thing would be, I think in the 21st century, it's a two-way street. I don't think we can credibly say conversion is perfectly legitimate and reasonable, but nobody should ever leave Christianity to become a Buddhist or become a Hindu or become a Muslim and so on. I don't see the logic of saying people can only convert in one direction, otherwise it's a matter of social conditioning or something. I think the religious possibilities that are opened up, and we see so many people, perhaps people in this room, crossing over religious boundaries all the time. And I think we can't, those of us who are Catholic, like me, can't just say, well, that's a bad thing, isn't it too bad that they gave up on the faith? It may be too bad in some cases, but the possibility of converting and be so, as I was trying to say, so intellectually, spiritually, effectively caught up in what you study, that you say, yes, that is where I want to be. Sometimes people don't know their own tradition enough before they do that. But the final thing I guess I would say is that we have to be able to take the religious traditions seriously enough that we could convert to them. And I think I would be lying to you if I said it was absolutely inconceivable because I know the errors of Hinduism and so on, I'd never think of becoming a Hindu. I can imagine in various ways that I'd be quite happy in certain traditions of Hinduism. But I never felt the call to leave my faith and cross over. And tell you the truth, this is a complication, I'll stop with this. Many Hindus I know are happy that I haven't converted, basically saying, look, Clooney, in your life, you're from Brooklyn, you're Irish Catholic, you have white skin, in your next birth, you will be one of us. What's the rush? If you can't find God where you are, do you really think changing religions is going to help you? Now that's a twisted, complicated way to look at it, but I think, you know, if you can see, I'm sort of saying both and. Keep the door open to conversion, see it as a two-way street, take the risk, but also know your own tradition before you jump to another tradition. I think there's one more.
Last question.
Hi, thank you for a great lecture tonight. So something that your talk made me think about is this tendency towards being spiritual and not religious. And I was really struck by the deep spiritual resonance that you found in your studies of Hinduism and in your own deeply rooted Catholic faith. And so I was wondering how your experience as a comparative theologian could respond or ask questions toward that.
Well, I think we have to live in the world in which we're living. And if you study, you know, Pew surveys on religion in America, if you look at statistics on where people are, usually, but not only younger people, so many people are spiritual but not religious. So many people are on the move and are kind of mingling different traditions together. Again, as I said before, we can't just lament that and say, well, that's too bad, that shouldn't have happened. I teach at Harvard Divinity School, where there are many of our students who, for very good and serious reasons, have backed away from institutions, mostly from Christian or Jewish institutions, but are finding themselves kind of on the road as pilgrims, looking for the sacred, trying different things. And I think, where does the comparative theologian come into this? I always make a big thing, as I did tonight. Well, for me, the story has to start with being, as I've repeated about 10 times now, Irish Catholic, born in Brooklyn, of staunch Catholic family, going to Catholic grammar school, Catholic high school. And then kids look at me, I think of them as kids because I'm getting old, college students and graduate students look at me and say, yes, but I didn't grow up with that. My mother was a former Catholic who's a Buddhist. My father didn't seem to believe anything. Or they said, we'll let you entirely alone until you're 18 and then you can figure it out yourself. That it's not possible to say, comparative theology works if you are a staunch believer who belongs to a tradition, and from that tradition you venture out to the other and then you come back home. That's very nice, and I think it works for very many people. But I try to tell my students in class, you come from somewhere. It's easy. I mean, Harvard Divinity School, it is a divinity school. Students who show up there, even if they are spiritual and not religious, even if they have a very vague doctrinal base, there's something in their life that has drawn them not to the Harvard Law School, Harvard Business School, but to the Divinity School. And say, if you can't start with staunch, if you have the misfortune of not being Irish Catholic, or if you have other misfortunes in life, where do you coming from? What is it that has motivated you? Did you ever have an experience when you were 14 or 15 that transformed your life? Go from there. So I tell them again and again, I'm trying to explain certain things to you and share certain things with you, but I'm not asking you to be me. I'm asking students to find out where they are and can they venture forth and take a risk from there. And I don't see any reason why a spiritual but not religious student can't do that, because we all are somewhere culturally, psychologically, bodily, and we can go to the other. And in the other, we, as Pope John Paul II said, we meet God. We go to the sacred ground in the burning bush. And you don't have to be a card-carrying member of a religion to do that. You can do it from wherever you are. It's just that you have to have self-knowledge, and that's a big thing that I guess goes back to Socrates and so on. I hope that helps.